March 7, 1945. The Rhine River, Western Germany. The dawn broke cold and gray over the water. Mist clung to the surface of the Rhine like a shroud, thick enough that a man standing on one bank could barely see the opposite shore. The air smelled of damp earth and cordite, the residue of artillery fire that had echoed through the valley for weeks. German sentries, hollow-eyed and weary, peered westward from their concrete bunkers, watching for the inevitable. They had been told the Americans were coming. They had been told the Reich would hold. But in those quiet hours before sunrise, as the fog rolled and shifted like a living thing, many of them wondered if what they had been told still mattered. Across the river, hidden in the tree lines and village ruins, American engineers crouched beside their equipment. Pontoons lay stacked and ready. Steel beams gleamed dully in the pre-dawn light. The men wore the grime of weeks without proper rest, their uniforms caked with mud, their hands raw from handling cold metal. They did not speak much. There was no need. Each man knew his role. Each man had rehearsed this 100 times in training camps back in Louisiana and Tennessee, where they had crossed mock rivers under the eyes of stern instructors who barked about speed and precision. But this was not Louisiana. This was the Rhine. And on the other side waited an enemy who would do everything in his power to stop them. When the order came, it came quietly. A raised hand, a nod. And then, as if choreographed by some unseen conductor, the Americans moved. Trucks rumbled forward through the mud. Pontoons slid into the water with barely a splash. Engineers waded into the frigid current, their breath steaming, their movements swift and practiced. Within minutes, the first sections of the bridge began to take shape. Within an hour, the structure stretched halfway across the river. By the time the sun broke through the fog, a complete tactical bridge spanned the Rhine, and American infantry was already crossing, their boots drumming a steady rhythm on the wooden planking. The Germans opened fire, of course. Artillery shells screamed down from the hills, sending geysers of water and shrapnel into the air. Machine gun fire raked the bridge, sparking off metal and splintering wood. Men fell, pontoons ruptured and began to sink. But for every section destroyed, another was dragged into place. For every engineer killed, 2 more stepped forward to finish his work. The bridge held. The Americans kept coming, and within hours, tanks were rolling across the Rhine, their treads grinding over the very river that Hitler had sworn would never be breached. German commanders, watching from their observation posts kilometers away, could not believe what they were seeing. They had studied the Rhine their entire careers. They knew its width, its depth, its treacherous currents. They knew that bridging such a river under fire was considered, by all military doctrine, to be a near impossible task. The Wehrmacht itself had taken days, sometimes weeks, to construct similar crossings under far less hostile conditions. Yet here were the Americans, erecting a bridge in a matter of hours, under direct artillery bombardment, as if the laws of engineering and warfare had been rewritten overnight. One German officer, a major who had fought in Poland and France and Russia, lowered his field glasses and turned to his aide. His voice was quiet, almost disbelieving. "They are not soldiers," he said. "They are builders. They are something else." He was not wrong. To understand what the German commanders witnessed that day, one must first understand what the American military had become by 1945. The United States had entered the war late, in December 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor. At that time, its army ranked 18th in the world, smaller than that of Belgium. Its officer corps was inexperienced. Its industrial base, though vast, had not yet been turned toward war. But within 3.5 years, America had transformed itself into the greatest war machine the world had ever seen. It produced more planes, more tanks, more ships, more weapons than all the Axis powers combined. It trained millions of men. It built supply chains that stretched across 2 oceans. And, perhaps most remarkably, it created an engineering capacity that seemed, to its enemies, almost supernatural. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was the embodiment of that capacity. Before the war, it had been responsible for building dams, levees, and canals across the American interior. Its officers were civil engineers, men who understood soil and water and stress loads, who thought in terms of cubic yards of concrete and tons of steel. When the war came, those skills were weaponized. The Corps expanded rapidly, absorbing tens of thousands of recruits and training them in the art of military construction. They learned to build roads through jungles, airstrips on coral atolls, and bridges over rivers that had stood as natural barriers for centuries. They learned to work under fire, to improvise when supplies ran short, and to rebuild what the enemy destroyed faster than the enemy could destroy it. By the time the Allies reached the Rhine, the Corps of Engineers had become a force unto itself. Its battalions carried prefabricated bridge sections, Bailey Bridge components, and pontoon systems that could be assembled in configurations to suit almost any terrain. They had mechanized everything. Trucks carried the materials. Cranes lifted them into place. Bulldozers cleared approach roads. The engineers themselves moved with assembly line efficiency, each man a cog in a machine designed for one purpose: to keep the army moving forward. No matter the obstacle, the Germans, by contrast, had spent the war destroying bridges, not building them. As they retreated across Europe, they blew every crossing behind them, hoping to slow the Allied advance. They mined roads. They flooded fields. They turned every river into a defensive line. It was a strategy born of desperation, and it worked for a time. The Allies were forced to halt at each new barrier, to bring up their engineers, to construct a crossing, to lose time and momentum. But what the Germans did not fully grasp was that each delay only made the Americans better at overcoming it. Each bridge destroyed was a lesson learned. Each river crossed was a refinement of technique. By 1945, the U.S. engineers had bridged the Loire, the Seine, the Moselle, the Saar. They had done it under fire, in the rain, in the dark. They had done it so many times that it had become routine. The Rhine was supposed to be different. It was not just another river. It was a symbol. It was Germany's natural moat, the last great barrier between the Allies and the industrial heart of the Reich. The river was wide, over 300 meters in many places, and fast-flowing, swollen with spring snowmelt. The Germans believed it could not be crossed quickly. They believed that even if the Allies managed to establish a foothold, they could be driven back before the crossing became permanent. They believed they had time. They were wrong. On the night of March 7, 1945, men of the 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, one of the last intact bridges over the Rhine. It was a stroke of luck, a fluke of war. The Germans had wired the bridge for demolition, but the charges failed to detonate properly. American infantry stormed across under fire, and within hours, the Allies had a foothold on the eastern bank. Hitler, upon hearing the news, flew into a rage. He ordered the bridge destroyed at all costs. Luftwaffe bombers were sent. Artillery was massed. V-2 rockets were launched against it, one of the few times in the war that Germany's wonder weapons were used for tactical purposes. The bridge took hit after hit, and yet American engineers kept it standing. They shored up the damaged spans with timber and steel. They built pontoon bridges alongside it to handle the overflow of traffic. They constructed Bailey bridges upstream and downstream. They worked around the clock, in shifts that blurred day into night, sleeping in foxholes and eating cold rations on the move. When German artillery fire intensified, they worked through it. When the Luftwaffe appeared overhead, they dove for cover, then climbed back out and resumed as soon as the planes passed. And when, on March 17th, the battered Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed into the Rhine, killing 28 engineers who had been working on it, the American command barely paused. By that time, there were 6 other bridges operating nearby. The collapse of one was an inconvenience, nothing more. German commanders watching from the eastern hills were stunned. They had thrown everything they had at those crossings. Bombs, shells, even frogmen trained to plant demolition charges on the pontoons. And yet the bridges kept functioning. Tanks kept rolling. Trucks kept hauling supplies. It was as if the Americans possessed some inexhaustible reserve of materials and men, as if every destroyed section was simply replaced by another, pulled from an endless stockpile hidden somewhere beyond the horizon. In a sense, that was true. The American supply chain was a marvel of logistics, a system so vast and efficient that even the men operating within it sometimes struggled to comprehend its scale. Behind the front lines, depots the size of small cities stockpiled everything from ammunition to bridge components. Trucks ran day and night along the Red Ball Express and other supply routes, hauling materials forward. Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic by the hundreds, their holds crammed with steel and timber and concrete. Factories in Pittsburgh and Detroit and Chicago ran triple shifts, churning out the raw materials of war. It was an industrial juggernaut, and it was aimed directly at Germany. The Germans, by 1945, had no equivalent. Their factories were bombed, their supply lines were shattered, their stockpiles were depleted. They could destroy bridges, yes, but they could not replace them. They could fight, but they could not sustain. And so, when they watched the Americans rebuild in hours what had taken weeks to destroy, they were not just witnessing superior engineering. They were witnessing the collapse of their own strategic assumptions. The war had become a contest not just of armies, but of economies, and Germany was losing badly. The psychological impact on German troops was profound. Soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front, who had endured the hell of Stalingrad and Kursk, spoke of the Americans with a kind of weary admiration mixed with dread. On the Eastern Front, the enemy had been brutal but comprehensible. The Soviets fought with mass and fury, human waves and artillery barrages that turned the earth into a moonscape. It was terrible, but it was war as the Germans understood it. The Americans were different. They did not hurl men forward in suicidal charges. They brought machinery. They brought organization. They brought an industrial capacity that seemed limitless. And when they encountered an obstacle, they did not try to break through it with blood. They simply built around it. A German lieutenant captured near Remagen later told his interrogators, "We would destroy a bridge at night, and in the morning, it was as if we had done nothing. They would have a new one, sometimes two. We could not understand it. We thought perhaps they had brought the bridges with them, already built, but that made no sense. How could you transport a bridge? And yet, there it would be, stretching across the water, and their tanks would be crossing, and we would fall back again." Another soldier, a sergeant from an engineering battalion, put it more bluntly. "We were taught that Germany was the master of engineering, that our technology was superior. But the Americans, they did not have better technology. They just had more of it, and they used it faster than we could stop it. It was like fighting a flood. You could pile sandbags all day, but the water kept rising." This sense of futility spread through the German ranks like a contagion. Men who had believed in ultimate victory began to doubt. Officers who had trusted in the Führer's promises of wonder weapons and miracle offensives saw those promises dissolve in the face of American bridging operations. The Rhine, which was supposed to be the bulwark that held the Allies at bay for months, had been crossed in a matter of days. And once crossed, there was no going back. The Americans poured across in a torrent. Divisions, corps, entire armies, and the Wehrmacht, already bled white by years of attrition, simply could not hold. But the engineers did not stop at the Rhine. As the Allied armies drove deeper into Germany, they encountered more rivers, the Weser, the Elbe, countless smaller streams and canals. The Germans blew every crossing, just as they had before. And just as before, the Americans rebuilt them. Sometimes they used pontoons. Sometimes they used Bailey bridges, those modular wonders of British design that could be assembled like a giant erector set. Sometimes They simply bulldozed rubble into the water and laid steel matting on top, creating a causeway that could support tanks. The methods varied, but the result was always the same. The bridges went up, the army kept moving, and the Germans kept falling back, their defensive lines unraveling like a sweater with a pulled thread. There was a rhythm to it, almost musical in its repetition. Advance units would reach a blown bridge. They would call for engineers. The engineers would arrive, assess the site, and begin work. Pontoons would slide into the water. Cables would be stretched across the gap. Steel decking would be laid. Within hours, often before the enemy had fully withdrawn from the opposite bank, the bridge would be complete. Infantry would cross, secure a perimeter, and the engineers would begin widening the crossing, adding more lanes, reinforcing the structure. Trucks would follow, then tanks, then artillery, and then the army would move on, leaving the engineers behind to maintain the bridge until the next obstacle appeared. It was not glamorous work. Engineers did not charge enemy positions with bayonets fixed. They did not fly fighters or command battleships. They waded in cold rivers and hammered steel and laid sandbags. They worked until their hands bled and their backs screamed. They slept in mud and ate standing up. And they died, often, when German artillery found the range or a bomber slipped through the flak. But they kept working, because they understood, perhaps better than anyone, that wars are not won by heroes alone. They are won by logistics, by the unglamorous labor of men who build roads and haul supplies and keep the machinery of war grinding forward, mile by mile, bridge by bridge. The Americans had learned this lesson well. They had studied the campaigns of history, had read how Napoleon lost in Russia not because of a single great battle, but because his supply lines collapsed. They had seen how the British in World War I had been bogged down for years in the trenches, in part because they could not move supplies forward fast enough to sustain an offensive. The U.S. military, in contrast, had built its entire doctrine around mobility and logistics. Patton's famous racing across France in 1944 was not the result of tactical genius alone. It was the result of fuel trucks and ammo dumps and engineer battalions that kept the roads open and the bridges standing. Without them, Patton's tanks would have been immobile sculptures rusting in the fields. The Germans understood this, intellectually. Their own military theorists had written extensively about logistics and supply. But understanding and executing are different things. Germany in 1945 was a nation starved of resources. Its oil fields were gone, its refineries bombed into rubble. Its railroads were shattered. Its factories were running on fumes, if they ran at all. The engineers of the Wehrmacht, who had once built the autobahns and spanned the great rivers of Europe, were now reduced to scrounging for materials and improvising repairs. They could not match the Americans, not in speed, not in scale, not in the sheer abundance of resources. And so they watched, helpless, as their carefully prepared defensive lines were bypassed or breached within days of being established. One German general, captured in April 1945, was brought to a temporary headquarters near the Elbe River. He was a career officer, a man who had commanded divisions in France and Russia, who had been decorated for valor and promoted for competence. As he was led through the American camp, he saw rows upon rows of trucks, supply dumps stacked with crates of ammunition and food, engineer battalions unloading bridging equipment from trailers. He stopped, staring, and his escort, an American colonel, asked if something was wrong. The German general shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "Nothing is wrong. I did not understand until now. We were told that America was soft, that its people were weak, that they could not sustain a war. We were told that your soldiers were shopkeepers and farmers, that they would break under pressure." He gestured at the camp around him. "But you are not soldiers in the way we are soldiers. You are a nation of builders. You make war the way you make everything else, with machines, with organization, with abundance. We could never have won, could we? Not against this." The colonel, who had landed at Normandy and fought his way across France and Belgium and Germany, considered the question. "No," he said finally. "No, I don't suppose you could have." That abundance was the key. It was not just a matter of having more tanks or more planes. It was a mindset, a way of approaching problems. When the Germans faced a destroyed bridge, they saw an obstacle that would take days or weeks to overcome. When the Americans faced the same bridge, they saw a construction project, something to be managed and completed on schedule. They brought cranes and welding torches and concrete mixers. They brought blueprints and engineers who had built skyscrapers and dams. They brought the collective expertise of a nation that had spent a century taming a wilderness and building infrastructure across an entire continent. And they brought the confidence that comes from knowing that if something breaks, you can fix it, and if something is missing, you can build it. This was not the attitude of a military alone. It was the attitude of a society. Americans in 1945 had grown up during the Depression, had seen their government put millions to work, building roads and bridges and schools through the New Deal. They had watched their factories retool for war production almost overnight. They had seen the impossible become routine, and when they went to war, they brought that ethos with them. They did not accept limitations. They did not assume that a blown bridge meant a halt. They assumed that a blown bridge meant a few hours' work, and then they would move on. The bridge, in this sense, became more than a piece of infrastructure. It became a symbol. To the Germans, each destroyed bridge was a small victory, a way to slow the enemy, to buy time. To the Americans, each rebuilt bridge was proof of something larger, that will and resources and ingenuity could overcome any barrier. It was a message, delivered in steel and timber and sweat, that the war was already lost for Germany, that no amount of fighting could reverse the tide. The Americans would keep coming, and they would keep building, and every river and every valley and every bombed-out city would be spanned and crossed and left behind. German soldiers, in their letters and diaries, often returned to this theme. They wrote of feeling overwhelmed, not by superior tactics or firepower, but by the sheer relentlessness of the American advance. "They do not stop," one soldier wrote. "When we destroy a bridge, they build another. When we blow a road, they clear it. When we fight them, they call in artillery and planes and tanks, and then they move forward again. It is like trying to hold back the tide." Another wrote, with a kind of bitter resignation, "We were told we were fighting for our homeland, for our families, for the fatherland. But what good is fighting when the enemy can simply rebuild what you destroy? What good is courage when the enemy has 1,000 trucks for every one of yours? I do not fear the American soldier. I fear what stands behind him, the factories, the ships, the endless supplies. We are fighting a machine, and machines do not tire." There was truth in those words. The American war effort was, in many ways, a machine, a vast interlocking system of production and transportation and logistics. But it was also more than that. It was the product of a democracy that had mobilized willingly, a people who had chosen to fight and who had sent their sons and husbands and fathers to do so. It was the product of a nation that, despite its flaws, believed in the possibility of a better world, a world without fascism, without tyranny, without conquest. And that belief, perhaps more than any weapon, was what the Germans found so difficult to combat. By the end of April 1945, the war in Europe was effectively over. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, the Elbe, and every other river in their path. They had driven to the heart of Germany. Soviet forces had surrounded Berlin. Hitler was dead by his own hand in a bunker beneath the ruined capital. And the engineers, those unglamorous laborers who had built the bridges and cleared the roads and kept the armies moving, began the next phase of their work. Reconstruction. They repaired the bridges they had built. They cleared the rubble from bombed cities. They restored roads and rail lines. They built refugee camps and displaced persons facilities. They turned their skills, honed in war, toward the task of rebuilding a shattered continent. It was a transformation as remarkable as any that had come before, a shift from destruction to creation, from war to peace. In later years, historians would analyze the campaigns of 1945, would study the battles and the strategies and the decisions of generals. They would write of Eisenhower's broad front approach, of Patton's dash across Germany, of Montgomery's careful, methodical advance. But often, in those histories, the engineers would be footnotes, mentioned briefly, if at all. And yet, without them, none of it would have been possible. Without the bridges, the armies would have stalled. Without the roads, the supplies would not have reached the front. Without the relentless, unglamorous labor of men who worked in mud and cold and danger, the war would have dragged on, month after month. With incalculable cost in lives and suffering, the bridges themselves, those temporary structures of steel and wood, did not last. Most were dismantled after the war, their components recycled or scrapped. The pontoons were deflated and stored away. The Bailey Bridge sections were disassembled and shipped to other theaters, or sold off as surplus. The rivers flowed on, as they always had, and in time, new permanent bridges were built, grand structures of concrete and steel that bore no resemblance to the hasty wartime crossings. But for a brief moment in history, those temporary bridges were the most important structures in the world. They were the hinges on which the outcome of the war turned. There is a photograph, taken somewhere on the Rhine in March 1945, that captures something of this. It shows an American engineer, a young man in a mud-splattered uniform, standing on a pontoon bridge. Behind him, tanks are rolling past, their crews grim-faced and focused. The water of the Rhine churns around the pontoons, dark and cold. In the distance, smoke rises from shelling, a gray column against a gray sky. The engineer is not looking at the tanks or the smoke. He is looking down at the pontoon beneath his feet, checking the cables, making sure the structure is secure. His expression is one of concentration, of a man absorbed in his work. He is not thinking about history or symbolism or the larger meaning of the war. He is thinking about stress loads and water depth and whether the cables need adjustment. And yet, in that single image, there is a truth that transcends the moment. The engineer, doing his unglamorous job, is the embodiment of everything the Allies brought to the war. Competence, resourcefulness, an unshakable belief that problems can be solved. He is not a warrior in the classical sense. He is a builder. And it was the builders, in the end, who won the war. The German commanders who watched in disbelief as the bridges went up overnight were witnessing the end of an era. They were witnessing the defeat of a military philosophy that valued will and doctrine and superior breeding. They were witnessing the triumph of a philosophy that valued production and logistics and the practical application of resources. They were witnessing, though they might not have articulated it in these terms, the victory of democracy over tyranny, of abundance over scarcity, of a society that builds over a society that conquers. In the years after the war, some of those German commanders wrote memoirs, tried to make sense of what had happened. They analyzed the battles, critiqued decisions, argued over what might have been done differently. But often, when they spoke of the American engineers, their tone shifted. The frustration and disbelief gave way to a kind of reluctant respect. They recognized, in retrospect, that they had not been defeated by superior tactics alone, or by overwhelming numbers. They had been defeated by a nation that had turned its entire industrial capacity toward war, that had married its engineering prowess to military necessity, and that had fielded an army capable of building as fast as the enemy could destroy. One former general, interviewed decades later, put it simply, "We thought we were fighting soldiers. We were fighting a civilization. And that, perhaps, is the final truth. Wars are not fought only with guns and tanks and planes. They are fought with steel mills and assembly lines and engineering schools. They are fought with truck drivers and welders, and the men who wade into cold rivers to anchor pontoons. They are fought with the accumulated knowledge and resources and will of entire societies. Germany, by 1945, had exhausted its resources and broken its society. America, arriving late to the war, had mobilized its vast potential and turned it into an unstoppable force. The bridges over the Rhine were not just military assets. They were statements of intent. They said, "We are here and we will not be stopped. We will cross every river, overcome every obstacle, rebuild everything you destroy, and we will do it faster than you can comprehend." They were, in steel and timber and sweat, the physical manifestation of a nation at war, a nation that had committed itself fully to victory and that possessed the means to achieve it. When the last guns fell silent in May 1945 and the unconditional surrender was signed, the bridges remained. Some stood for weeks or months, carrying the traffic of occupation forces and relief supplies. Others were dismantled almost immediately, their purpose served. But the memory of them lingered. For the Americans, they were a source of pride, proof of what their engineers could accomplish. For the Germans, they were a reminder of the gulf that had existed between the two sides, a gulf not of courage or valor, but of capacity and resources. In a ruined farmhouse near Remagen, an old farmer who had watched the war unfold from his shattered doorstep was asked years later what he remembered most. He thought for a long moment, then said, "The bridges. The Americans, they built bridges like we plant wheat. One day there was nothing, the next day there was a bridge, and tanks were crossing. I thought to myself, these are not men making war. These are men who can do anything they set their minds to. And I knew then that Germany was finished." He was right. The war was decided not in a single battle, but in 1,000 small victories of logistics and engineering. It was decided in the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of California and the training camps of the American South. It was decided in the minds of engineers who looked at a blown bridge and saw not a disaster, but a problem to be solved. And it was decided on the banks of rivers across Europe, where those engineers turned theory into practice, and where they built, under fire, the roads to victory. The Rhine, that ancient river that had guarded Germany for millennia, was crossed in a day. The Elbe followed. The war ended, and the world moved on. But the lesson remained, etched into the landscape and the memory of all who witnessed it, that wars are won not only by those who fight, but by those who build. And in the spring of 1945, the Americans built faster than the Germans could destroy. They built with a confidence born of abundance, with a skill honed by practice, and with a determination that no river, no matter how wide, could deter. The bridges rose overnight, spanning the impossible, carrying the weight of history. And when the German commanders lowered their field glasses and saw what had been accomplished in the space of a few hours, they understood, finally and completely, that the war was lost, not because they lacked courage, not because their soldiers had failed, but because they were fighting an enemy who could do the impossible as a matter of routine, who could turn destruction into construction, who could look at the end of a road and simply build a new one. That was the power of American engineering. That was the power of a democracy mobilized. And that, in the end, was the power that won the war. The bridges are gone now, swept away by time and the river's current. But their legacy endures. They endure in the roads and cities rebuilt after the war. They endure in the Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of Europe. They endure in the memory of men who served, and in the historical record that honors their service. And they endure as a reminder that the most powerful weapons are not always the most destructive, that sometimes, in the midst of war, the act of building matters more than the act of destroying. The German commanders could not believe how quickly the bridges went up, but the Americans, who built them, were not surprised at all. They had known, from the beginning, that they possessed something their enemies lacked: the ability to create, to improvise, to turn resources into results with a speed and efficiency that seemed, to those who witnessed it, almost magical. But it was not magic. It was competence. It was organization. It was the product of a free society that had chosen to fight, and that had brought to the battlefield not just soldiers, but the full weight of its industrial might. And so, on a gray morning in March 1945, as the fog lifted over the Rhine and the first American tanks rolled across a bridge that had not existed 12 hours before, the outcome of the war was written not in fire and blood alone, but in steel and timber and the steady, unglamorous labor of men who built while others destroyed. They were the unsung victors. They were the engineers, and they changed the course of history, one bridge at a time.